T.S. Eliot as a moralist. A great literary critic can be a most influential moralist, and in this role, Mr. Eliot has been one of our more important moralists. He has influenced us most, and to an extent which is not at once apparent, so deeply have his lessons been taken to heart, in his less obviously didactic critical writings, wherein he has, with some success, attempted to reintroduce certain kinds of moral standards into literary criticism. He has also written a considerable number of pamphlets, more immediately edifying in their purpose, and as editor of the Criterion, he constituted himself, over many years, a close commentator upon his times. In one's prose reflections, one may be legitimately occupied with ideals, whereas in the writing of verse, one can only deal with actuality. In an age when an exaggerated respect for technicians and experts has silenced many voices, Mr. Eliot has been one of the few authoritative persons to continue to utter bold and simple counsels and to draw attention, in politics, to general principles. I shall, in what follows, be most immediately concerned with these simpler pronouncements uttered for edification, but in order to understand them it will be necessary to pursue Mr. Eliot's themes into his more strictly critical writings also. How can one be a moralist in this age? What does one appeal to? To appreciate the nature of Mr. Eliot's moral appeal, it is necessary to see the basis of his opposition to liberalism. This exercise is the more valuable since it is surely of the greatest importance for any of us in these days to examine what we take this concept to be. Mr. Eliot sees liberalism as the end product of a line of thought which is to be found in Stoicism, in the Renaissance, in Puritanism, in the Romantic movement, and in 19th century humanism. Characteristic of this line of thought is a cult of personality and a denial of authority external to the individual. In the fissure between Dante and Shakespeare lies the loss which Mr. Eliot mourns. The self-dramatization of Shakespeare's heroes foreshadows the romanticism of the modern world. The Puritans continued more insidiously to undermine tradition and authority, and with their thin mythology inaugurate the age of amateur religions. Authorized by Kant, inspired by Blake, and more recently encouraged by Huxley, Russell, Wells, and others, every man may now invent his own religion, and have the pleasures of religious emotion without the burdens of obedience or dogma. To Puritan influence, too, Mr. Eliot, acknowledging a debt to Tawney, traces much of the materialism of our modern industrial society with its worship of success. He himself remembers the morality in which it was tacitly assumed that if one was thrifty, enterprising, intelligent, practical, and prudent in not violating social conventions, one ought to have a happy and successful life. Romanticism, that debilitated Renaissance, with its denial of original sin and its doctrine of human perfectibility, attacking an organism weakened already by the Puritans, produces the new style of emotional individualism, and humanism, in an attempt at remedy, confounds the categories even further by offering a high-minded version of that confusion of art with religion, which, with the Romantics, had at least remained at a more orgiastic level. So, out of Matthew Arnold, out of the dream world of late Romantic poetry, out of the mid-19th century, the age of progressive degradation, issues liberalism, the imprecise philosophy of a society of materialistic and irresponsible individuals. Mr. Eliot's writings lack the note of tiresome messianism which we find, for instance, in T.E. Hume, but there is no doubt that he presents us with a picture of a humanity fallen or divided or alienated, to use the Hegelian term which seems oddly apt here, in certain respects, and equally that he has his own positive conception, and one which informs his critical writings, of that unity which has been lost and is again to be won. Art should not be the expression of personality. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. The sermons of Andrews are superior to those of Donne because the emotion of Andrews is not personal. Donne is a personality in a sense in which Andrews is not. His sermons, one feels, are a means of self-expression. He is constantly finding an object which shall be adequate to his feelings. Andrews is wholly absorbed in the object, and therefore responds with the adequate emotion. Sometime in the 17th century, poets lost the capacity for direct sensuous apprehension of thought. They no longer felt their thoughts as immediately as the odor of a rose. Sensibility was dissociated. Emotion parted company with thought and broke loose on its own. Romanticism encouraged its undisciplined expression, and as men lost their sense of limit, poetry lost its hardness. It was Baudelaire, that true blasphemer and believer in sin, that was the first counter-romantic in poetry, and one of the initiators of the movement which we connect with imagism, and notably with Mr. Eliot, which attempts to reintroduce precise emotion and to draw the artist's attention back to the object. This putting of emotion in its place is at the same time a putting of poetry in its place. Poetry cannot play the part of religion. The more we realize what literature is and what it cannot do, the more we return soberly to a sense of our own limitations. Baudelaire, Mr. Eliot says, would surely have approved of these words of T.E. Hume. Man is endowed with original sin. While he can occasionally accomplish acts which partake of perfection, he can never himself be perfect. Certain secondary results in regard to ordinary human action in society follow from this. As man is essentially bad, he can only accomplish anything of value by discipline, ethical and political. Order is thus not merely negative, but creative and liberating. Institutions are necessary. I give merely a sketch of what is clearly a profoundly unified attitude, whose literary faces have metaphysical faces to correspond. This unity of Mr. Eliot's attitude is also my excuse for treating as one position utterances made over a number of years. Dissociation of sensibility serves as a symbol for Mr. Eliot of the loss, in some far more general sense, of a unified world. The loss of a sense of limit and of an understanding of where each thing has its place. The limiting and rendering of precise emotion is one aspect of the criticism of the messy and uninhibited liberal individual. Liberalism, then, destroys tradition through challenging authority. In a society where every man's opinion is equally valuable, there is no unity of outlook. This favors over-specialization, the worship of techniques, and the division of one part of society from another. Liberalism is a creed which dissipates and relaxes, and it prepares the way for that which is its own negation, the artificial, mechanized, or brutalized control which is a desperate remedy for its chaos. We have the choice of a society bound for the extremes of paganism, or a society more positively Christian than our own. Mr. Eliot turns to appeal, over the head of the dominant creed of the time, to an older, purer tradition. The historical reality upon which he relies is the Anglican Church, the only instrument through which the conversion of England can be achieved, and he pictures a Christian society inspired by a Christian elite, and reminded by the Church of standards which lie beyond the individual. There is a revolution of our time and a new sensibility in the creation of which Mr. Eliot has played a major part. And before going on to consider his morals and politics more closely, let us look for a moment at this scene of change. G. E. Moore, the father of modern philosophy, and incidentally a thinker hailed with approval by Hume, placed as epigraph to his Principia Ethica the words of Butler: "Everything is what it is, and not another thing." And when Mr. Eliot himself remarks, apropos of poetry and religion, that nothing in this world or the next is a substitute for anything else, he speaks with the voice of the age. We have become increasingly, sometimes excessively, self-conscious about our concepts and our language, and anxious to delimit categories and prevent the spilling over of one thing into another. Mr. Eliot's is not the only eye which looks upon the 19th century as an era of messy thinking, and one can readily parallel, in other disciplines, his exasperated cry. Arnold does not see what poetry is. Science, philosophy, history, criticism have become more specialized, more acutely conscious of their own limitations. Mr. Eliot, too, is, in this respect, exemplary. He has carried, one wants to say with a sort of heroism, his self-awareness about language into the depths of his poetry, into the intolerable wrestle with words and meanings, and the attack upon the general mess of imprecision of feeling. Unlike some other poets in the Imagist tradition, Mr. Eliot has never lost his respect for words. The desire, as Hume put it, to hand over sensations bodily, has never led Mr. Eliot to make war upon language after the manner of Mallarmé or Pound. One of the deep characteristics of his poetry is a continual concern, in the midst of difficulties, for the referential character of words. This one most movingly feels in the four quartets. As a prose writer equally, Mr. Eliot has shown an exemplary sense of the limitations of his job. He does not trespass upon the field of technical philosophy, but says what he has to say, as critic and as moralist, precisely and appropriately. He is aware, and shares this concern with certain contemporary moral philosophers, that a deterioration in morals is a destruction of concepts. If our convictions part company with our vocabulary of justification, our controversies become empty. We are living at present in a kind of doldrums between opposing winds of doctrine, in a period in which one political philosophy has lost its cogency, though it is still the only one in which public speech can be framed. This is very bad for the English language. Good prose cannot be written by people without convictions. In these ways, Mr. Eliot is not alone, but belongs with other makers of his age. He is the great poet of the new sensibility, one aspect of which is categorical precision, while the other aspect is what Hume called cinders and Sartre called nausée. The return to the object has its unnerving moments. It is essential to prove that beauty may be in small dry things, said Hume. The great aim is accurate, precise description. The first thing is to recognize how extraordinarily difficult this is. One is reminded of the hard, dry, piecemeal character of the philosophy of Wittgenstein. For precise description reveals to the unillusioned gaze a world reduced to pieces, men and bits of paper whirled by the cold wind. The synthesis of the 19th century, that premature and shallow integration, is no longer available to us. To what can we appeal? Mr. Eliot, it seems, is very much a member of our age, but with the zeal of a rationalist, using that word in its popular sense. He tends to attribute his insights to the Christian tradition, narrowly considered, while he collects the contemporary vices together under the name of liberalism. In spite of his appreciation of compromise-making Anglicanism, that uneasy bed, Mr. Eliot is more fundamentally an anti-Puritan Puritan, invoking the evil-conscious Puritanism of Hawthorne and James against the decayed Protestantism of the present, in which he sees on one hand the materialism analyzed by Tawney, and on the other the dreary hymn-singing pietism which he attributes to D.H. Lawrence's mother. He speaks of those vast hosts of the dead, of whose presence James Joyce was aware. But the dead whom the political Mr. Eliot venerates lie far away. Mr. Eliot is notably not in the English conservative tradition. He is an eclectic moralist. One feels that the voice of Krishna, bidding us not to think of the fruit of action, rings more loudly in his ears, whereas he is less patient with that medley of voices, to which T.H. Green, for instance, lent careful attention, which constitutes the English political creed. He praises Bradley, who is wise, whose philosophy, unlike that of his successors, is Catholic, civilized, and universal, and who destroyed, more surely than Arnold, the bases of contemporary Benthamism. But Mr. Eliot's own political and philosophical understanding is remote from the flexible and concrete thinking of the idealists. One finds in him something of that Jansenism of temperament which he attributes to Pascal. Mr. Eliot, with his dislike of untidy lives, being perhaps also one who cannot avoid seeing through human beings and observing the vanity of their thoughts and their avocations, their dishonesty and self-deception, their insincerity of their emotions, their cowardice, the pettiness of their real ambitions. One feels this disillusioned tone in Mr. Eliot's political writings, especially in his attitude to the mob. He declares alarmingly that he would prefer an illiterate audience to an audience of ill-educated or half-educated persons, such as are now available. And it is significant that he extends no sympathy to the English nonconformist tradition, with its wide-reaching utilitarian and socialist connections. When Methodism receives a kind word in the book on culture, it is partly because it helped to pave the way for the Oxford movement. With hair-raising thoroughness, Mr. Eliot rejects the stuff of our liberal world. I find something instructive here in his attitude to certain novelists. He gives approval to Jane Austen, Dickens, and Thackeray, because with them, personality was more nearly in its proper place. The standards by which they criticized their world, if not very lofty ones, were at least not of their own making. But George Eliot unfortunately combined her profounder insights with the dreary rationalism of the epoch, and is of the same tribe as all the serious and eccentric moralists we have had since, and whom Mr. Eliot deplores. But it is in D.H. Lawrence that the extremity is reached, of heretical belief and unrestrained and morbid emotionalism. Mr. Eliot finds in Lawrence a lack not so much of information as of the critical faculties which education should give, and an incapacity for what we ordinarily call thinking. This is an astonishing judgment. Whatever is thinking if Lawrence couldn't think? And what is serious moral reflection if George Eliot, whatever her beliefs, does not present a most lofty instance of it? I think that this is more than a verbal question, and I would connect it very cautiously with some of Mr. Eliot's views on Shakespeare. Mr. Eliot says that neither Shakespeare nor Dante did any real thinking, but it happened that at Dante's time thought was orderly and strong and beautiful, and so Dante's poetry receives a boost. Shakespeare is also compared unfavorably as a thinker with Marlowe. I suspect that what lies behind these uses of language is a somewhat abstract and mathematical model of thinking, orderly, strong, beautiful, which one may connect with medieval Christianity and Thomist metaphysics. And one might suggest in reply that our mixed-up modern world needs for its unraveling a type of sensitive, concrete understanding, to which, if we deny the name of thinking, we are lost. But these are only hints and guesses. Mr. Eliot has rightly said that it is important in what terms a justification is framed. Pagan statesmen may be contained by the Christian ethos of their people. Only certain justifications will serve. It is especially important now to keep alive such sources of moral response as remain to us. It seems to me that Mr. Eliot plays dangerously when he rejects in toto the moral content of liberalism, and appeals over its head to a conception of dogma and authority which can itself play an ambivalent role. In 1933, Mr. Eliot remarked that it was better to worship a golden calf than to worship nothing. And in 1939, he said that he would object to fascism because it is pagan. Objections to oppression and cruelty are objections to means, not to ends. In fact, the ordinary person dislikes fascism because he is fearful of authority. To argue in this way is to belittle that naked respect for the human person as such which one may connect with Locke and with Kant, and which one hopes has become a part of the English political tradition. Can this be set aside as a romantic overvaluation of the individual? It is at least perilous to neglect the remnants of that liberal moral absolutism which, without dogma, holds that there are certain things which cannot be done to human persons. It is to such a remnant of liberal faith that a book such as P.H. Simon's Contre la Torture is addressed, and has perhaps not altogether failed. It may be added that John Stuart Mill, that argumentative and undogmatic absolutist, was not merely a romantic, but was remotely a maker, too, of that dry and critical atmosphere in which Mr. Eliot, among others, has flourished. Mr. Eliot may reply that morality must be based on truth, and that he is more concerned with the promulgation of truth than with the cultivation of benevolent impulses resting on misunderstandings. It may be that the Christian tradition must be the salvation of the West, but to argue this too narrowly is to neglect aspects of liberalism which are, to put it mildly, worth preserving, and to neglect, too, the extent to which liberalism is entwined with our Christian tradition, as it, in reality, and as a working power, now is. We may agree profoundly with many of Mr. Eliot's indictments of present-day society, and agree with him, for instance, when he says that the events of September 1938 inspired in him a doubt of the validity of civilization. And there are events since then which inspire similar doubts, but whatever our religious beliefs, we must hope that the liberal world can regenerate itself out of its own resources, and we must seek the Christian tradition in its various forms within that world. I would agree with F.R. Leavis, who, in defending D.H. Lawrence against Mr. Eliot, said, "It is characteristic of the world as it is that health cannot anywhere be found whole," and added that the sense in which Lawrence stands for health is an important one. We cannot now afford to squander any of our health, which must be sought, with discrimination, in many quarters. And to say this is, of course, to take up a liberal attitude. At the last word, however, one must return to Mr. Eliot the poet. Mr. Eliot observed that the essential advantage for a poet is not to have a beautiful world with which to deal. It is to be able to see beneath both beauty and ugliness, to see the boredom and the horror and the glory. Mr. Eliot has seen, and it is a great part of our health, that we have a poet who can penetrate our anxious, trivial world with such a profound compassion. In his poetry, Mr. Eliot is no Jansenist. We need thus to be helped to imagine that which we know, and to say this is, of course, to take up a romantic attitude.